have for those representing organisations who are involved in advocacy and support for children in out-of-home care and care leavers. And perhaps, Your Honour, if we can follow the same format where each of them is sworn in.
All right.
So the first one is Mashidi.
Mashidi, would you prefer to take the oath or the affirmation? Has someone talked that through with you about the
Affirmation.
the choice? The affirmation. Thank you.
Could you stand up, Mashidi?
And if you could just repeat after me, please. I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence that I shall give
in this Royal Commission
in this Royal Commission
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Mashidi. You can take a seat.
Ms Reid?
Affirmation, please.
Again, could you repeat after me, please? I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall
that
give
the evidence I shall give
in this Royal Commission
in this Royal Commission
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the
and
truth.
nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Ms Reid.
And Dr Colwell?
Affirmation, please.
Thank you. Just again ask you to repeat after me, please. I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
in this Royal Commission
in this Royal Commission
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Doctor, if you take a seat, please.
Ms Porteous?
Affirmation, please.
Could you repeat after me, please? I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
in this Royal Commission
in this Royal Commission
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Take a seat, please.
Thank you, Your Honour. Ms Reid, if I can start with you. You're the CEO of Create Foundation,
Yes, that's right.
and we have heard a little bit about Create from your two volunteer consultants who have given evidence. Can you tell us a bit more about the foundation?
Well, we're a national organisation. We have offices in each state and territory and one regional office in Alice Springs. We've just lost funding in New South Wales for the Newcastle office, but we do have offices in those other places, and we have about 43 staff across the country.
And what do you particularly do in relation to children in and out of home care and those leaving care?
We have a sort of a mantra, if you like. The overall mission of the organisation is to improve the lives of children and young people in care. But the mantra sits under connect, to empower, to change. So that's the three things that we do. So we connect them to each other, their community, and to create, which sort of reduces the isolation that they're feeling and also enables them to participate. We empower them through some of our leadership programs and activities which build their self-confidence to be able to have a say and to be able to be in forums like today. And then we change the system through policy advice and research. We've got a research team as well. So those are the three things that we do.
How do you gain access to children currently in care?
It's a really good question. We are funded by every state government to provide services to children and young people, and where they give us KPIs that we have to meet, and we have a service agreement that's formal and binding, usually goes for 3 years. However, they don't tell us where the children are. So we are in a very invidious position to spend about a third of our time searching for the children and young people, trying to build relationships with agencies, service providers, NGOs of all descriptions, and directly with the children and young people. So once we have that access, we've got a database called Club Create, and that's the connection point for the kids where we keep their details and provide them with a club-type environment around membership. So they belong, they get entitlement. So when they enter care, they get an entering care kit, they get magazines bi-monthly, that type of thing. So there are things in there that keep them connected to us and for them to get some value out of the relationship.
Most of the children that you work with and young people in home-based care?
Across all care types. So we probably recently we've just been sort of interrogating our data to see how many are from kinship care, because we know that they are probably the most unlikely to join with us at Create, predominantly because of stigma reasons. If you've got a family-based placement, you would be less inclined to join. But we've got about 12,000 members at the moment of all care types.
And do you have many who are in residential care?
Quite a few in residential care, yeah.
Proportionately fewer in residential care, I take it.
Of course, because the numbers are lower.
Is it more difficult to gain access to children and young people in residential care?
I know that we heard from the young people that was their experience, but generally speaking, no, because we're a national organisation that's been around for a while. We also have departments giving us permission to carry out research, and they support our research, and we get formal ethical clearance and so forth. So we've got a different sort of perspective, but generally trying to get access to kids in residentials is as difficult as it would be to contact kids in the general population, not more so generally.
Thank you. Ms Sheedy, you're the Executive Officer of Care Leavers Australia Network. What does that organisation do?
CLAN is the National Support and Advocacy Network for older people who grew up in Australia's 900 plus orphanages, children's homes and foster care.
And what do you do on behalf of care leavers?
We access their records, if they so desire them, from the churches and charities and state governments. We produce a newsletter every 2 months. It's the only place in Australia where care leavers can have their stories written and produced, published in Australia. We help trace families. We believe their stories of what happened to them. We get their parents' war service records. We reunite people. We create awareness of the Royal Commission. I think we've been at every out-of-home care or orphanage public hearing in Australia, except for the one in Darwin. I've gone blank.
Do you receive funding in each state?
Oh yes, we get breadcrumbs. Unlike Create, we don't get funded by every state of Australia. It's absolutely shameful.
Who do you get funded by?
We get 35,000 from New South Wales. We get 17,000 from the Victorian government. We get zero and never have got a cent from Queensland. We get nothing from the Northern Territory. We get nothing from the Western Australian government, and we get 15,000 from the South Australian government. We get 3,000 a year from the ACT government, and we get, did I say Tasmania?
Not yet.
Tasmania, we get zero. And
What
the
sort of-
only reason that we are still in existence is because of the funding for the Royal Commission. We would have had to have closed our doors.
What sort of staffing do you have, Sheedy?
We have 2 counsellors part-time, one based in Sydney, one in Victoria. We have an office manager. We have a web designer who does the web. That job's part-time, 4 days a week. We have a caseworker 5 days a week and a receptionist 4 days a week. And I'm CEO. And we support people to go to the Royal Commission, of course.
Where are you based?
We're based in Sydney, and we have a shoebox of an office at Ross House in Flinders Lane in Melbourne.
Thank you. If I can turn to you, Doctor, your position and organisation?
I'm the Advocacy Project Manager in Violence Prevention at People with Disability Australia.
What does your organisation do?
So, People with Disability Australia is a national peak body representing the interests of people with disability. We're also a disabled persons organisation, which means that we are a voice of and for people with disability. Our board is entirely constituted of people with disability in our membership is purely people with disability, except for associate members. We provide a range of we do a range of different things. So we have individual advocacy, which provides an independent person who is on the side of a person with disability in whatever issue they may be facing. We also run a range of training programs, particularly responding to sexual assault for disability service providers, respectful relationships training for people with disability. We also do systemic work, and that's where I'm situated. Obviously, my work is around violence and responding to violence, abuse and neglect of people with disability. We were funded by the Department of Social Services as a Royal Commission community-based support service, and in that role we provide advocacy to people who may be affected by the Royal Commission.
What data are kept in relation to children and young people with a disability who are in out-of-home care?
Do you mean nationally?
Or however you can describe it, nationally or by state or territory?
So there's been some recent changes in relation to the Child Protection National Minimum Data Sets, but some of those changes have not necessarily given us a better sense of the rates of disability amongst children who are in out-of-home care. That's essentially because placements that are funded by disability services or medical or psychiatric services, juvenile justice facilities or supported accommodation assistance placements where children with disability are likely to be overrepresented are not included in the national minimum data sets. And that means that we still don't actually know the numbers, but we do know that children with disability are overrepresented in all of those settings. So, yes.
Any data you're aware of in relation to allegations of child sexual abuse by or about children with disabilities in out-of-home care?
Not data, and I have to say that in general, data about prevalence for people with disability, not just children, but for people with disability as well, is very poor. The exclusions that affect the Child Protection National Minimum Data Set also affect the Australian Bureau of Statistics in their collections as well. So that means that the Personal Safety Survey, which is understood to be one of the major sources of information about personal violence that is experienced, also excludes a number of the residential settings where people with disability are overrepresented. So
what about your organisation's understanding of the prevalence of such allegations in out-of-home care?
We see a lot in individual advocacy. Yes, I think we would say that children with disability are overrepresented in the kinds of the forms of out-of-home care where we know that violence and abuse are more common and where they are less likely to be reported.
And what are those?
They tend to be segregated institutions of various kinds, so or places that are particularly gate-kept, I suppose, and some of the descriptions earlier of residential care from, I think it was Tash, really rang true about some of the difficulties that we see as well. So places where services have particular levels of control over people's lives, where they don't necessarily have huge amounts of exposure to the rest of the community, and in return there's little community oversight of the kinds of standards of behaviour within those settings. They can also be settings where restrictive practices are used, which is an unusual element, I think, in relation to out-of-home care. It can be permissible to subject a child to seclusion or to chemical restraint, for example, and those elements raise the risk for children with disability of experiencing harm for a number of different reasons. They can break the trust that they may have with staff, which makes it less likely for them to disclose. It can shift their understandings of what acceptable behaviour is within an institution, which may mean that they are less likely to even recognise what they're experiencing as abuse. And it can also physically leave them in very vulnerable situations.
Thank you. Ms Porteous, you're working with Youth Futures WA,
Yes.
and you're the Homeless Services Manager.
Yes, correct.
What does your organisation do in relation to children in or leaving out-of-home care?
We deliver a number of programs, not specifically for children leaving care or in care. However, they're homeless young people. So within that, unfortunately, young people leaving care or within care are placed in homelessness services. Our program and services is in the Perth metropolitan area. We deliver crisis accommodation, transitional accommodation. We have an accommodation program for young parents, which are late in pregnancy and with newborn infants. Specifically designed to keep the infants from entering the care system. We have a drug education and support program and 2 alternative education programs for those young people.
Do you keep any records as to those young people who come to your attention, whether they've been in out-of-home care?
Yes, we have to, as part of the National Affordable Housing Agreement, the NAHA program, which is a federal and state government funded program, enter data into the Australian Institute of Health and Wellbeing data set, so that is collected. Where the abuse has occurred, though, isn't broken down.
So what can you tell us about children and young people who use your service in terms of them having been in out-of-home care?
We have a variety of young people on a continuum depending on their situation, but essentially they've all become homeless for many different reasons. We provide accommodation for young people aged 15 to 19, so many of those young people may have never been in care, so some of them have come straight out of the family home, or some of them are been transient living on the streets. Some of them are also exiting detention centres, so the Corrective Services Department, and many or several young people are placed with us who are in the care of the CEO or are open cases with the department. They're usually young people that have had multiple placement breakdowns and displayed challenging behaviours. They may be young people experiencing crisis, as discussed this morning. So there's a whole gamut of behaviours and challenges with the young people we work with.
Thank you. Just coming back to you, Ms Reid, you would have heard this morning the young people talking about why they think others in similar positions don't talk to somebody when something harmful has happened to them while they're in out-of-home care. And they gave a number of reasons, one being stigma associated with it, being thought to be a troublemaker, not being believed, and I think quite significantly from their evidence that if they're happy otherwise in the placement, it'll mean they'll be moved.
Yeah.
What can we do now to improve the situation and the environment in which these children and young people are living to better enable them to report if something bad happens to them?
I think that listening to the young people, and the young people that spoke today are reminiscent of many of the young people that we speak to at Create and certainly capture in our research, is very much that they want solid, good, reliable relationships, trusting relationships with their caseworkers. And I think that there are many things that prohibit that from happening. And like they talked about the urgency and crisis-driven work that they're doing. Especially for young people that are transitioning, they need dedicated workers, and there are many models overseas where they have dedicated leaving care workers that are focused on the kids being equipped to live independently, successfully when they leave care, because they're very vulnerable at that point. So I think some of it is around having more resources for workers or having lesser caseloads so that they can develop those meaningful relationships with young people. And I'd suggest that the reason that they have so many changes of staff is because the workers are not feeling fulfilled child protection is a very difficult area to work in, and is also attracting staff into that area has its own stigma for workers to want to step into that space. So you've got to look at the worker attrition as a significant issue that needs to be addressed, because if they can develop trusting relationships with people, they're going to be more likely during that engagement to be able to disclose.
There was talk this morning of mentoring programs whereby young people who have left care mentor those still in care. Is that something your organisation's involved with?
Look, we've done several submissions. We haven't been successful with them. We had a Create mentoring program that was attached to our Create Your Future program. So children in that stage of leaving care, 15 to 18, would be given a mentor to help them in that next phase, especially. But we weren't successful with that. So we're very committed to the process. And myself personally, I developed a volunteer support mentoring program in Queensland, and that ran for a number of years. That was for lower age children to be connected with kids in care to provide that mentoring support, but it was defunded. What happens with mentoring programs, they're seen as the soft sort of option for governments. There's not really tangible results. It's all kind of feel-good results. And in a language of, you know, outputs and measures, it's not often attractive. But I think that it's the way forward. I think that mentoring programs definitely have something to offer because they're flexible. And the young people, the program that I ran, the young people were able to, they interviewed their mentors to check they're like a job. So they would have a panel, we would find 2 or 3 mentors that we thought might be suitable, and the young people interviewed them to select them themselves. So it was something that they had choice over. A number of young people have said to me over the years that they don't want people paid to be nice to them. So I think the aspect of mentoring and volunteering is something that's important to them, that it's not another adult in their lives as part of some monitoring process. I think there's room for that, but I think that what they are seeking is that personal one-on-one relationship that they have some control over.
Thank you. Ms Sheedy, from the experience of your organisation, what could be done now to better create an environment whereby children in care currently feel more able to speak up about harmful things happening to them?
I think we should value children in care.
I'm sorry, I think we might just need to move your microphone a bit over. That's by all means.
Well, I think that governments in this country have gotten away with treating children in care as second-class citizens. There are no votes from children in care. I think that every minister and every worker who is responsible for children in care need to be reminded that Australia is a signatory to the rights of children, and everybody should sign an agreement that they will do their level best to help children in care get an identity. And I think children in care, we need to learn from what happened to us. Don't repeat what happened to us. I think that, you know, those young people that were on the panel today, if they are, you know, people in care today know that it takes years and years for us to come forward and disclose what happened to us. And we have to live with the lifelong consequences that we didn't go and report the crimes to the police. And, you know, maybe they could learn from us. I don't think anybody that works in the Department of Community Services in these countries understand the history of what happened to us and to generations of children in care, dating back to the 1800s when, you know, the first industrial skills were put into this country. They're not taught history. They're not taught about what happened to us. So how do they really understand how to meet the needs of children today and to gain their trust and to encourage them to disclose if they've been sexually used?
What do you think about having people separate from the department or the non-government organisations that's delivering the care made available through some means or another, mentoring or other means, to develop relationships with the children so that outside the formal structure they've got someone to talk to.
Like the Scottish Commissioner for Young People, something like that.
Yes, that could be one example.
Oh. Anything that will benefit children coming forward and disclosing is worthwhile trying. I think we need to look at the large percentage of children that are actually removed from this country. There are 43 that you disclosed this morning? 43,000 children are in care in Australia, and there are 68,800 in the UK. And they've got triple our population. What are we doing to support families to keep their own children? We've got an industry that employs an awful lot of people in out-of-home care. Why aren't we supporting these families to maintain their children?
So your view would be more resources should be put into families at an earlier stage, perhaps before they reach crisis, to enable them to better care for their children and keep their children without those children being removed.
Most definitely. And, you know, some of us older care leavers have had our children removed from us. But, you know, nobody's ever come back and asked us, you know, parenting for us is extremely difficult when we didn't get our own needs met. How do we go on and love and nurture the next generation of children? And nobody ever comes back and offers us any support in parenting. And why are the state governments being charged with neglect of their own children? They've abdicated responsibilities for us once we turn 15 and 16. And these were our legal parents, the governments of this country, and they've gotten away with a terrible neglect to us. I think it's disgraceful.
Doctor, children with disabilities are in a different position again, because depending upon the nature of the disability, they may well have difficulty giving voice to what's happened to them. How do you see that the environment within which kids with disabilities live in out-of-home care that can be improved to give them a greater voice to describe what's happened to them?
So there's a number of things that I think we would like to see put in place. One is that we actually don't think that children should be segregated, and there are important natural supports that arise through having children be included as part of the community. And I think, whilst I think that contemplating some of the more formal mechanisms by which those supports can kind of come into place, I think it's really important to recognise that there's protections that come simply from knowing more people in the community and having interactions with more people. That said, I think there's a few things that would help. Better disability awareness amongst frontline workers, particularly there seems to be a perception that is sort of built into the child protection system in Australia that disability is something very serious and and so there are kind of two options. There's the disability response and the child protection response. And that tends to mean that children with fewer needs wind up in child protection without the recognition of their disability. And that can mean that frontline workers don't recognise what might be going on with that particular child. And on the other hand, in the disability response, you also wind up with people assuming that challenging behaviours are a result of, for example, adolescence, when in many cases we know that challenging behaviours are a response to trauma. And as I mentioned earlier, that can mean that restrictive practices are the response to trauma that happens in some of these settings, which is clearly compounding some of the problems there. I also think that explicit and accessible sex and relationships education must be made available to children with disability. This is partly because when they are living in segregated settings, they may not be exposed to the kind of general playground conversations about sexuality and relationships, and that can leave them vulnerable to abuse because they don't recognise that that's what it is. In fact, many of the, when we deliver training to people with disability, we often find that they didn't have a language to describe what had happened to them, and they certainly didn't recognise that it was wrong. And so equipping children to be able to recognise and name what has happened to them is really, really important. I also think that workplace cultures within within all out-of-home care settings, particularly residential places, but in the other settings that I mentioned earlier, respite care, some of the supported accommodation placements and so on, I think they need to be better trauma-informed so that they recognise what's going on. But I also think there needs to be a workplace settings that is less reliant on police checks and working with children checks, and more reliant on some of the those things need to be in place, but there needs to be an openness within the organisations, a recognition of people's human rights, so that as children might begin to disclose, there's an awareness that there are many, many impediments to a disclosure, so it needs to be taken extremely seriously whenever someone hints towards a disclosure.
Now, you've been talking particularly about within the organisation that's providing the service for the children and young people. What about outside of the organisation, be it some sort of mentoring role or some visitoring process? Is that something that you think would assist particularly with children and young people with a disability?
Community visitors have been really important in the disability sector, but they also haven't necessarily prevented many of the instances of violence and abuse, in spite of being in place for a very long time. As we provide individual advocacy, we are very mindful of the importance of having someone who is not attached to any of the other kind of support or service provision frameworks that are around a particular child. And obviously, we think that independent advocacy is something that is really irreplaceable. The independence enables the advocate to solely be on the side of the child, and that is with no conflicts of interest, and that's a really unusual position to be in. But we struggle to get access to some of the facilities in which children may be living, and it's not clear to us that the availability of advocacy is made clear to those children as well. Formally, they should be able to access it. Whether or not that happens in practice, we would think that that it's not made clear to them that it's a possibility.
Thank you. Ms. Porteous, with the children and young people who come to your service having left out-of-home care and being homeless, do you think that the way in which you engage with them provides an opportunity for them, if they've been harmed in out-of-home care, to disclose?
Yeah, definitely. I think the unique nature of the service we provide is in employing qualified and very skilled youth workers. So part of their profession is developing that immediate engagement, trust and rapport. It's a very strong advocacy and empowerment model where the young person is the primary client. There's very clear rights and responsibilities offered to the young people about this is what you'll expect from me, this is what I'll expect from you. And the young people really respond to that most of the time. In particular with our crisis accommodation service, we very openly let them know that to gain access to the service, we're going to need to hear what's been happening, why are you in this position, and which quite often opens the door to hearing whether it's family conflict, or I'm out of the family home because I've been abused or sexually or physically or emotionally abused. So the young people are more often than not quite forthright in disclosing information. Some of them may have had to repeat the story over several occasions, so they're quite well versed at explaining the situation. Others, it may be the first time they've disclosed the traumatic history.
With those who have disclosed to your agency for the first time, what responsibilities do you take on as an agency for telling others about the abuse they've disclosed?
Given the nature of the agency. There's mandatory reporting in Western Australia. However, and depending on the history and how the client would like or the young person would like to progress, we'd very much focus on that, giving them the information on which decision they make and what may be the implications regarding that, and whether that be police or child protection involvement, particularly paying attention if there's younger siblings or it's an ongoing situation, would prioritise and direct the decision for the young person.
So with mandatory reporting, is it the case that in Western Australia that requires you to report a child or young person under 18 who you believe is currently at risk of harm?
Not ourselves, teachers, nurses, doctors, all are under the mandatory legislation, I believe.
But you're not?
No.
So when you referred before to mandatory reporting, who were you referring to as having that obligation?
Other involvement with the young people. It's more often than not the young people who we're supporting are engaged with teachers, education, GPs, doctors, nurses. So we'd explore those options as well.
You'd explore the options with the young person of telling somebody like that of what had happened to them.
Yeah, and the importance and significance of doing so.
Thank you. Back to you, Ms Reid. The way in which authorities or people to whom reports or disclosures are made is clearly a big part of responding to sexual abuse in out-of-home care. What's the experience of your agency in the responsiveness of those departments and other public bodies to whom you either disclose or refer a child or young person to disclose sexual abuse in out-of-home care?
We are a systems advocate, so we, whilst our interaction at ground level is with children coming into programs and activities, we're not in a direct position often to receive this directly from the young people. Sometimes during the course of our research we may ask questions about abuse and reporting of abuse, so it's basically that I'll refer to. But overwhelmingly from young people, it's often the process that's the most daunting. The telling of the abuse, once they get it out to someone, is often that sort of cathartic moment that they disclose. And they often disclose abuse in very different ways to what adults are used to hearing. They'll often allude to something, or they'll be a little bit vague, where to them they've told an adult, but we might be left wondering, was that what I thought it was? So it's often not as clear cut. The experience that young people report to us that's difficult for them is the fact that the believability factor and knowing actually who to go to and the child-friendly nature of being able to make a complaint. And workers on the ground that we talk to often say to us they're not actually sure themselves where the complaint needs to go to and what the process is for them. And often the reluctance of people that the children disclose to in the first instance is part of the problem. They're reluctant because they don't quite know what to do with it. They don't know where to go themselves, and sometimes adults feel very uncomfortable with these matters because there's such a stigma associated with it. So,
what can we do to disseminate more to those who need to know what the avenues of complaint are?
I think that we have wonderful public awareness campaigns like in the public health model with smoking, anti-smoking, and that's made a massive difference in that area. Domestic violence is another area that the government are really focusing on at the moment. I mean, that's not proven that that's had an impact because it's a very different thing that you're trying to stop. However, I think that a very large campaign aimed at the public that breaks down the myths and legends that surround sexual abuse and blaming the victim, making it clear what they need to do and when they need to do it. Agencies we need a common set of language, a common understanding across the country about where to go, how to do the reporting, who's responsible to make it clearer. But I think when you leave that to, like, each government department is responsible, or someone's responsible, but no one's really quite sure who, and the information gets lost.
What would you see as the key components of an effective complaint scheme whereby children and young people and adults who've experienced sexual abuse in out-of-home care can easily and effectively negotiate?
I think that listening to the kids this morning really brought it back first of mind, is that it has to be confidential. They need a service that they can trust that is confidential. It needs to be easily accessible and child-friendly in its language, and it needs to be filled with obviously highly trained people that are going to believe the child in the first instance and take what they're saying seriously. You know, some of the young people that I've spoken to, people often react and say, are you sure? You're not just trying to get your carer in trouble. That's very prevalent with the kids. So we need to remove those. It needs to be a service that's really professional and a service that's child-friendly. I mean, I just can't stress that enough. And child-friendly means actually involving kids in the development of some sort of service or process that they follow. Some governments are really good at complaints process consultation. In Western Australia, they consulted us. We sat down with the young people looking at the complaints process, worked together to come up with a flow chart. Whether or not the actual complaints process itself was particularly effective, but there are some moves in some circles that those types of consultations are held. But we've got to go back and ask the kids. They've got to have a voice in this process. I think that's essential.
So the children who were involved, or young people who were involved in that process, were they concerned about being able to meet face to face with someone they were complaining to?
Not that I recall, not particularly, no. A lot of the young people expressed to us that they would prefer to have a conversation with someone that they knew and trusted, and then that person would accompany them in that kind of setting. So there was a lot. That's why the mentoring and the or a community visitor, or whatever that person might be, is very important in that process. The complaints process is often one they don't want to embark on by themselves.
No. Whether there are multiple pathways to complain or a single pathway, is that a matter that you think children and young people are affected by?
Look, I think that when you read out the big list of places before about, you know, all the different avenues and the ombudsman, and then there's the children's commissioners, and then there's the actual the advocates that sit within departments. I think that it's confusing for us as a service provider to be able to get our head around, well, what's the path we need to follow. So I think that the language and the common understanding, we need to start getting the different avenues of where to make a complaint and how, and trying to get some level of understanding that there can be many gateways, but we need to know what they are, because often it's not clear.
No, thank you. Ms Sheedy, some of your members will have disclosed reasonably recently in the last few years as to the abuse they've suffered in out-of-home care, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
What have they told you about their experiences of making complaints?
Well, many of them haven't made complaints.
What of those that have?
Those that have, well, that they haven't been believed. They haven't had that sentence thrown at them, just want to get your carer into trouble. Yeah, we do want to get them into trouble. We want them arrested. A lot of them say, you know, that they weren't believed by the police, that, you know, it happened too long ago, they'll be dead, it's your word against theirs. Yeah, and one recent fellow who went to the police in the last 3 years, both in New South Wales and Victoria, you know, they took his statement and tried to get his state ward file, and the department said they didn't have his file, and yet we got it just this year. So somebody's telling lies.
Have you noticed from what your members have been telling you of any positive changes in complaint handling from, say, a decade or so ago to more recently?
Well, I think Task Force Sano in Victoria is a change, but it's taken people one of those people sitting in this room now who had to write to the Commissioner, Ken Lay, to get his pedophile arrested. So I think...
So police task forces?
Yeah, well, that particular one. I don't know the others in the other states. They don't contact us. But we have a lot of, you know, we have a good working relationship with Task Force Sano, and they often ask us to, you know, advertise in the newsletters for people for particular years in orphanages, but we don't hear from the other states.
What other suggestions can you make to help the Royal Commissioners make recommendations to improve the way complaints are received by institutions from children or adults who, as children, were abused in out-of-home care.
Well, they shouldn't take anyone's statement unless they've got the state ward file there. The police shouldn't, because people, these crimes happened 40, 50 years ago. We can't remember the colour of the curtains or the date the crimes occurred. So, and elderly care leavers need an advocate to go to the police station with them. We feel scared because we were removed from our family of origin by the police. And so the police are just another authority figure that, had a part to play in us being separated from our families, however dysfunctional that family was. They're still our family.
What about reporting to places other than the police, like the Ombudsman and Children's Commissioners and the like? Has any of your members followed that path?
Not to my knowledge, they haven't.
So generally they go to the police?
Not generally, no.
Well, who do they generally go to if they're making a complaint?
They might come to us. A lot of them are disclosed to us for the first time. I encourage them to go to the police, but a lot of them just shoot back those same things that I said to you previously.
So when people come to you and disclose for the first time, as you've said, you encourage them to go to the police. Are there any other avenues that you tell them about that might help them tell someone in authority?
The Royal Commission. Not really. There's nobody else for people to report crimes to. Docs don't care about you. The Department of Human Services or Department of Human Sacrifices, they don't really care about children. As adults, why would we go back to the organisation that was responsible for our care? They've never contacted us.
So with the police, your suggestion would be that they obtain the file of the formerly child in order to better understand the chronology of what happened to that child and where they lived? And therefore the statement that was taken would be more accurate as to dates and times and the like?
Yes, and pedophiles wouldn't get let off, like the recent case this year in March in Melbourne.
Thank you, Ms. Schutte. Doctor, what do you see in terms of the people that you advocate for, would be a better system of complaint handling?
Obviously, each state has its own various ways of handling complaints. We often raise issues with the Ombudsman here in New South Wales. In some instances, that can lead to a resolution, but in many cases, the Ombudsman will do an investigation and there will be a report, but whether or not the recommendations will be implemented, it's not clear that they always are. And it's not clear that... And there are some complexities around that, I suppose, but I think the point is that the Ombudsman doesn't have powers to enforce those recommendations. And I know that in some settings, particularly for people who are residing in specialist settings, the response is to go to the Ombudsman or to the Disability Services Commissioner, but those responses rely often on conciliatory frameworks, and it's not clear that that's an appropriate response to violence. And at the same time, some of the responses from police to children with disability, there may not be the skills to be interviewing children with disability. There are impediments around legislative frameworks around evidence that will often preclude children from giving evidence, which I know the Royal Commission has explored in some detail. But even before we get as far as a potential court case, there are impediments at the level of police taking reports. We have a number of instances where they've simply refused or said it's not worth it, or taken a report and then there's no investigation. So there are a number of those kinds of issues which mean that there's a heavier reliance on some of these complaint mechanisms like ombudsmans and disability services commissioners, but that doesn't necessarily produce outcomes that are actually beneficial to the human rights of the individual concerned.
What changes can you suggest that would improve that situation?
I think that whatever the complaints body is, that it should be a no wrong door approach. That's been successful in a number of other settings. I also think that the complaints body, should have own motion powers, because I think that in many cases relying on a child to disclose is putting an undue responsibility on them, particularly when actually there are often rumours within that kind of circulate between workers about particular locations, but no one has evidence, for example. So I think our own motion inquiry is really important. I also think that that it needs to be focused on outcomes of human rights of children. And I think sometimes when we're talking about violence, it can look like the removal of the violence is enough to address those rights. And I think that we should be keeping our eyes on the fact that the rights of children are often neglected, and that is part of what puts them at risk. And so addressing those rights, so for example for a child with disability, being removed from a community, being tucked away in a segregated setting, could be understood as a failure to fulfil their rights, and that is part of what puts them at a higher risk. So I would like to see a complaints body that can actually produce outcomes in terms of the rights of children.
Thank you. Just on a different topic, if I can, Ms. Porteous, the young people who gave evidence this morning, and Doctor as well has referred to it, sex education, they said that they didn't feel adequately equipped in that area by their caseworkers. What happens with sex education in the young people that you come into contact with?
We deliver a lot of sex education and holistic independent living skills. A lot of the young people we see have had limited, say, suitable role models, and that may have come from institutional settings also. You would assume they've got good independent skills by that age. They haven't, unfortunately, particularly coming out of detention or kind of residential group homes. So it's all encompassing on personal hygiene, but then into the respect of sex education, puberty development, but then into healthy, respectful relationships as well with other young people, or how, we quite often see young people who may have had traumatic histories in inappropriate relationships, say 15-year-olds perhaps with 27-year-olds, etc., etc. So we spend a lot of time working with the young people and exploring how they may be disrespecting their body or displaying disrespectful, inappropriate behaviours, and providing a lot of education around what's appropriate and where you may get more support or education for that.
With your agency, have you had experience with young people who come into contact with your agency who themselves have sexually challenging behaviours?
Yeah, quite frequent. We're not able, or we don't have the capacity to accommodate sex offenders or young people who are on the sex offenders registry. So we do ask that, and with trying to get information from the department, that can be a challenge from corrective services or child protection and family services. Perhaps at times this information is not available at the point of referral. However, we do our best to explore all relevant history, and we don't have the capacity to take sex offender type of behaviours or a history of kind of predatorial behaviour. In saying that though, there are young people who may take advantage of other young people, and just the nature of the environment, some young people are incredibly vulnerable. And again, we just do our best to educate them on healthy relationships and, you know, how to take care of themselves in that respect.
What happens to those who are on the sex offenders register and who've left out-of-home care and are homeless?
Very, very difficult and very sad. Yeah, they don't have many options at all. We deliver a program which is accommodating young people leaving detention, and a separate program to the residential service. We generally try to get them housed in department state housing, appropriately placed, given the restrictions on their court conditions, etc. But it's very, very difficult to house these young people.
Ms Reid, what creates experience with young people or children who have displaying those characteristics?
Our only experience would be if they were attending a program or activity. Because our programs and activities are restricted in number generally because of, you know, safe ratios, we do a behaviour sort of checklist before young people can be coming into the program. A life skill program is a program offered for 15 to sort of 25-year-olds, so we have to be careful about, you know, the matching process. So through that process, we become aware sometimes that a young person might have a behaviour, usually from a worker. But when you're reliant on the young person, they often won't disclose. We often hear from other children and then have to put risk strategies in place. But that would be our only real avenue that we would hear about that.
Does that happen often?
No, not to my knowledge, no.
The young people this morning spoke about training and the need for those with whom they engage as being in out-of-home care, including carers, caseworkers and others, to have an understanding of their experience and being able to encourage disclosures and then deal with them appropriately. What do you say about the current training regime that's available?
I'd say, to be honest, that it was probably non-existent. I think that it's very ad hoc. Each government and agency would do it often, you know, some better than others. But I don't think that that there's a great understanding, let alone training.
What sort of training do you think would be most effective in this area?
I think training that, like I said before, sort of dispels the myths and legends, that provides very clear information about what your responsibility might be or where to go to make a complaint. I think that information provision is very important, but I also think it needs to be done in a manner that people can engage with it. Like that, there will be a real need for training to be almost workshopped and people become engaged with it, not something that's done to you. I think there's a real danger in that people start glazing over. We've got another set of forms or another group of package of material to read and it all gets too difficult. So I think that the way it's delivered needs to be very sophisticated.
Thank you. Ms Sheedy, you would have heard the young people this morning talk about their difficulties in obtaining records from the relevant Child Protection Agency. And I think that's an issue for your members as well.
It certainly is. Nothing's really changed. It's pretty sad to hear those kids talk about their experiences.
What are the experiences of your members who are much older generally than the young people giving evidence in seeking and obtaining their records?
The oldest member is 99. And many of them have great difficulties accessing their records, and the story of Western Australia is repeated. You know, you have to request what information you're after. How do you know what's in the file in order to request it? You know, it should be like every other state government. You just get the contents of your file, you know. I think that I've got lots of points I'd like to make about what should be put on files. And if you're removing a child today, it shouldn't be up to young social workers to make that decision. It should be a senior social worker make that decision. And they need to be identified. They need to actually write a letter to the child. Dear Myrtle the turtle, we've actually had to remove you today, the date, and these are the reasons why we've had to remove you. And if it was for neglect, they need to take photographs they need to provide the evidence, and their names needs to be on the bottom of the letter. These people shouldn't be able to hide behind, their names shouldn't be redacted from a state ward file. We need to know the truth of why we're removed from our families.
So would you say that letter should stay on the file until such a time as it's appropriate to give it to the
Most
child
definitely.
or young person?
And every single person who works in a Department of Community Services, from the minister down to anybody responsible for handling children in care, must read Orphans of the Living, Joanna Penglazer's book on growing up in care in 20th century Australia.
So in addition to setting out the reasons why a child was removed, what else would you want to see on the file?
Well, I want to see all our personal information left there. Why should we not be able to know where our parents resided in 1927 or 1964? You know, we're a signatory to the United Nations Rights of the Child, and governments have an obligation to provide an identity, yet they get away with all this redaction every single day.
So your members, when they get access to parts of their file, find that the sort of information you've described has been blacked out?
Yes. Or else there's information left on there that states that the state ward was residing with a pedophile in Macquarie Street, Sydney in 1993, and there's no follow-up on did they remove the child from the pedophile? Did they did they report it to the police? There's no follow-up on that file. And they were the legal parents of that care leaver.
You would have heard the young people this morning also speak about having to make an application for a particular defined period and having to gain permissions from those who might be mentioned in it in order for their names not to be blacked out. Is that an experience that your members have had?
Most definitely. And they even have to contact the people that we went for holidays with to see if they can release that information, or foster parents. I believe that foster carers are, they should be treated like public servants, and they should be given a decent wage. They're taking care of the most vulnerable children in society, and, you know, we should respect them for the decent ones. But we shouldn't, their names should not be redacted from a state ward file. We should be able to, we know, a lot of us know the names of, you know, foster carers that we were sent to, but if we're 3 years of age, of course we can't remember that. So those names should be there. You should sign a contract when you become a foster carer to say that, you know, my name will be out there for this child to know when they're 25 or when they go and access their file. Their names should not be redacted. They're getting a wage from the taxpayers of this state, or whichever state they do the foster care in. And, you know, governments shouldn't be whiting out these names.
Are your members, as of today, still seeking records from relevant state departments?
Are they ever?
And
And they wait a long, long time in New South Wales. We got a file that we applied for at the Port Lincoln prison in December 2013. We got it about 4 weeks ago.
And do you experience the case that the young people did where they only can ask for a defined period of time in their file?
That's Western Australia.
That's only Western Australia in your experience?
No other state asked for that, but, you know, we do need an audit of records because some states have randomly destroyed people's records, and, you know, we shouldn't be giving people false hope that their records would be there. If they could tell us which years have been destroyed, then that would save a lot of heartache and a lot of waiting for people.
With your knowledge of how this applies across Australia, can you help the Royal Commission with which state does it best and what components are the better?
Gee, I don't like giving gold stars out to government departments. Jesus. But maybe Victoria.
And what is it about Victoria that does it well?
Because they've got 45 days in which to provide the records. They've got legislation.
So there's a time period within which they have to provide the records. Do they have fewer blacked out bits?
No.
Are there any other components of the Victorian system of providing records you want to tell us about?
They present it nice. At least they give it to you in you know, when you went into care is the first page, whereas in New South Wales they actually spend time telling you it's best to, if you start from the back of this file, why can't they put it the first page at the very beginning? Show some respect for the care leavers, for goodness sake. Tell them to go at the back page.
Does anyone give advice to you about the fact that you should be with someone supportive when you read the file?
They do all of that, but you know, a lot of us don't want to have our hands held to read these horrific, horrible, judgmental files. You know, a lot of people get rotten drunk when they get their file. A lot of them burn it. A lot of them never opened them. You know, that's just covering their own asses, basically, so that, you know, then when they say, well, you know, you should read this in the company of somebody else, well, no, we don't need anybody to hold our hands.
Thank you. Just coming back to you, Doctor, and the issue of training and sex education. The latter would particularly be an issue, I take it, with some of the people who you advocate for.
Yes, in terms of whether they have had adequate training, to me. Yeah, I think one of the approaches that we use now, and it's partly, it has a number of purposes, but we tend to train disability service providers first, particularly to run through some of the myths that surround sexual abuse of people with disability, including children, which might be that they have a propensity to lie. That's one of the myths, that they may be oversexed or asexual. Those two options tend to circulate. And so being able to deal with some of those myths helps to create some of that workplace culture that I was talking about. We then would deliver training to the people residing in a particular location, and that way about respectful relationships, and that way we feel like there's a bit more change within the environment as well as for the individual. I think that there's a number of elements around sexual education for children with disability. It does need to be accessible, and that means that the specific support needs of the child need to be taken into account. And I think that's often not the case. And it can mean that, for example, if a child is in mainstream schooling, any sex education that's offered may not be appropriate and may simply, that they may not learn anything through that. So it's really important that there be accessible sex education provided. I'd also just add that we would like to see greater investigation of good ways to provide education and therapeutic programs to children with disability who have developed problematic sexual behaviours. Often these are the result of some of the peculiar kinds of cultures that can arise within segregated settings. But it's particularly important that that be made available because there aren't many, essentially.
Thank you. Ms Porteous, can I ask you about the use of social media and how that can be used as a force for good as well as a force for damaging behaviour?
Well, in regards to social media in our services, we don't have any kind of gatekeeping mechanism. The young people have access. It's interesting how many young people actually have mobile phone access, so it's more about education and staying safe and monitoring sort of cyberbullying and providing adequate support in those instances. In regards to being positive, I think there's a lot of young people doing exceptional things in the community and using social media as a voice such as Create Foundation. Yeah, so good and evil in the internet use.
Ms Reid?
You're referring back to social media.
Yes.
I think it's a necessary evil, to use that terminology as well. For us, it's at our peril as an organisation that's youth-centred, not to be assisting young people to use it as a medium, but also using it as a really proactive medium. It's a medium where young people often gain support from their peers through those networks, and they may talk about, services or ways to make a complaint. They share information that we could, as adults, probably wouldn't do on the internet, but they do. It's their lifeblood. The vulnerability factor is a real concern to create in our board, and certainly for us to be engaging with kids on social media has its own problems. Often they do disclose, and we're hideously underfunded for a national organisation, so to be able to have staff monitoring what kids are saying on our own site, so we kind of limit it to direct contact with kids through Facebook rather than on a page. So that is problematic. And of course it's people, these kids are vulnerable, they're preyed on, and there are some real deep concerns about that. But again, it's a place that the kids, it's their life, it's a new way of communicating. We can't do anything with it apart from really equip them and help them understand what some of those dangers are. And I thought it was interesting that the young people were talking about their carer actually sitting with them after they did a course and understanding and unpacking that, because for parents this is not how we were brought up. This is not, we don't even probably know half the dangers that might be out there or how they might protect themselves. So I think that there's a lot of education that needs to be focused in that area. So necessary, but with some caution.
Ms Sheedy, with your clan members, are they able to use any of the newer forms of communication to help them in finding information about their past?
Oh yes, yeah. When Clan started 15 years ago, the internet scared a lot of care leavers, and they didn't have, the skills. But as the years have gone on, a lot more of them are on the internet and on Facebook, which I'll call another name. I think there's a lot of support for each other on social media, but I really want to talk about the internet providers should be made to take a lot more responsibility for I can't stand the word child pornography. I wish the Royal Commission would contact the media organisations to call it what it is, child exploitation. I hope the Royal Commission will make a recommendation about the internet providers being made accountable for the trafficking of, children's photographs on the internet. They last forever, all those poor kids, those images.
Thank you. Thank you, Your Honour. I have nothing further.
Thank you. If you'll bear with us, just a few matters from me, and then I'll ask the other commissioners if they have any issues that they'd like to raise with you. And I might start with you, Ms Sheedy, given that in particular you're representing that older group of care leavers. So what you represent, of course, is what has happened in the past. You heard the young people this morning talking about the sorts of inhibitors to them reporting, and I think you made the comment to Ms Furness that it was a matter of some sadness for you that it sounded somewhat the same today as the sorts of problems you would have been hearing from your membership. But you also indicated to us that there are members of Clan who are reporting now after years and in some cases decades of silence. So I'm asking you to now try and articulate for us what you think the reasons are for that. Why now?
Well, I think it's because of the Royal Commission. But I spoke to a 73-year-old lady in Western Australia last week, and she's going in for major surgery. And the reason she decided, I was the first person she has disclosed, and she said that she did that because she didn't want to die without not letting somebody know what happened. I think that, you know, people are coming forward now because there is the highest authority in the land to hear these horrific histories. We're being believed, we're being listened to, there's good support out there. So, thank you to the Royal Commission.
So they're the things that you're hearing from your members are making a difference for them and giving them a place where they have confidence to speak.
And you know, governments are putting resources into the police. You know, the police are listening now, very much so in Victoria, but I can't really say the same for the other states because we don't hear from them, you know. So...
Have you... I listened with interest to you answering that question from Ms Furness about your experience and that you pinpointed the Task Force Sano in Victoria. Have you got any insights about why you're experiencing something different with that task force in Victoria compared to the others? Or
I don't think a lot of people know about Clan. I don't think the police know about Clan. You know, we're not high profile. You know, there's only close to 1,000 people. The agencies don't tell people about Clan. So if a lot of care leavers don't know about Clan, how's the general public going to know about Clan? They might see those red and white signs every time we're outside the Royal Commission raising awareness. But, you know, we don't have the resources to go out there and pay for big ads in newspapers or TV. We're only little fish in the sea.
Thank you. Can I ask you now about another topic, and that's about, again, what you heard the young people talking about this morning, about that, their interaction with their caseworkers, that monitoring of them in their placements, and I can see you looking somewhat bemused, as I thought you might. And I just wanted really to give you the opportunity to speak about what your members are telling you about what their experience was in general terms of interaction with government authorities, as you say, responsible for their care in the institutions in which they were placed.
Well, we didn't have a caseworker for a start. You know, we didn't even know that we were, you know, that we were state wards when we were in the orphanages. We were fed like little mushrooms, kept in the dark and told bullshit, you know, told nothing. So no wonder a lot of people that I deal with aren't even aware that they've got a state ward file on them. These are people in their 60s and 70s. You know, I have to ask them, have you got your state ward file? What's that? Oh, that's the file the government kept on you. Have you got that? No, I didn't even know I had one. So there's no big awareness raising. Somebody told me not to mention this, but I'm going to. Geelong Grammar and Scotch College, they put out a press release to say, come forward if you were abused in our schools. We've got counsellors for you. We'll help you navigate the Royal Commission. Somebody told me not to say that because it would be seen as a whinge. It's really interesting that the wealthy, the children of the wealthy, they get an invitation to go out, to come forward to their college, and they'll help them navigate the Royal Commission. Where are the governments who are our legal parents? Why aren't they trying to find us, their own children, and to support us to come to the Royal Commission? And we'll provide you with a counsellor, and we'll help you navigate the Royal Commission. There's no such media releases from the Department of Community Services in this country. Sorry if it's seen as a whinge.
Thank you. Ms Reid, can I move on to you and just ask you just a couple of matters that have arisen from the questions that Ms Furness put to you and the answers that you gave. Can I just go first to what's been referred to as the complaint process, and obviously seen in the context of the work of the Royal Commission. I understood you to say that the young children and young people that Create is working with generally don't want to embark upon that complaint process by themselves.
That's right.
Can you expand for us on the reasons as to why that's so in contemporary settings?
I think that sometimes it's the first time they've disclosed, sometimes it takes a while, and I'm not talking from a depth, or we haven't done research on this, so I'm using anecdotal information from what young people are telling me. But a lot of it's because it's difficult because the complaints processes are often government departments, they're formalised, they've got to fill out forms, go and see people, and they just feel that to go through that alone is almost re-traumatising them, and often they're not really sure about what outcome they want. But a lot of them, that's a real key to taking it forward. It's like, well, it's happened, I just need to get over it. But when they end up wanting to make the complaint, then they often seek out a person to assist them with that. So sometimes it might be a friend, family member, whatever it might be, but they often do seek that out. Yeah.
And are you able to articulate for us or point to any particular place or state or territory where you think that process of supporting or assisting a young person to use a complaint structure is working better than others?
No. I'd say they were all equally as daunting because they predominantly, like I said before, Western Australia certainly consulted with us. We did a body of work about complaints processes. We worked around the Charter of Rights in Victoria with the government, which was also, picked up the complaints processes, and they're great, but it's that really practical application of the kids actually taking that next step, making that phone call, that's the real challenge, and I don't think that it's aided particularly well in any state or territory, to be honest.
So it's about the people resources.
Yes.
In the end, so this doesn't matter how right the structure is. If the people resources aren't there,
yep,
the right people to give the assistance at the right time,
yes,
the complaint process won't work.
No.
Thank you. Dr. Cadwallader, can I ask you a few questions and on just across a range of topics? You spoke to us about the need to, in your sector, to equip children and young people with both an understanding of and a language for what has happened to them in the context, obviously, of sexual abuse. I'm going to ask you a similar question. Are you able to identify for us a program that is operating in that sphere and working even with some modicum of success?
I don't know of any, unfortunately. I know that there are people who are doing work in this area. I know that
as in developing programs.
Yes, but sometimes it's not clear how much understanding of disability there is, and sometimes, on the other hand, one of the things that happens a lot in the disability sector is that children can be treated as adults because the system is primarily designed for adults, and that kind of leaves children with disability in a bit of a gap. So, for example, our program is primarily designed for adults with disability around respectful relationships. So this feels like a major gap.
Okay, thank you. And you also spoke about the need to have the right culture in place, the right culture inside the institution. So I'm going to ask you the same question as to whether or not you can identify an institution or a range of institutions where, again, you think there's work being done in a positive way about developing good culture.
I think that one of the problems with attempting to bring a good culture into an institutional setting is that most of the institutional settings that we're talking about around children with disability are quite segregated. And that means that we're already talking about settings which have inadequate oversight from the community and can prevent children from developing the kinds of natural supports that I was talking about earlier. So whilst, yes, I think that there are movements towards better cultures within those settings, I also think that the settings themselves are impediments to those kinds of cultures because they are so detached from the rest of the world and there's such limited oversight. I also think that if we are talking about the rights of these children with disability, then and we want a culture that implements them, then to be honest, I'm not sure that many institutional settings do fulfil the human rights of children with disability. And that means that there's a tension if we want the workers within those spaces to be focused on rights outcomes, then we really need to be making sure that the settings themselves enable those. And that is around ensuring their inclusion within a community, ensuring proper recognition of their support needs and fulfilment of them. Does that make sense?
When you talk about the segregated nature of the institution, am I right in assuming that you mean it's an institution that is set up to house children and young people with disabilities rather than children and young people with disabilities being in mainstream settings?
So yes, that's part of it, although of course there are, I think, many states in Australia still allow children with disability to be housed within adult facilities as well. And so that, of course, comes with its own risks. But yes, I'm talking about settings where children with disability are grouped together solely on the basis that they have disability, which I think actually has some interesting impacts on the child protection system, in that knowing that that's going to be the outcome for a child whose disability is recognised may actually be an impediment for child protection workers in recognising disability in the first place. Because it's often well recognised that those segregated settings are quite different from where children may have been living before, and it may have all kinds of impacts on the relationships that they have with their friends and family. They may break down as a result of being placed in these settings. And so I think it does have impacts on what kinds of supports may be around a child, depending on whether their disability is recognised and also how it's recognised, what kinds of support needs, what kinds of supports need to be put in place, whether they are automatically placed in a segregated setting or integrated into the community with the supports brought in a mainstream setting.
Thank you. Just one final area, which is about contact with the police. So again, in response to a question from Ms. Furness, you provided us information about some of the difficulties children and young people have in making complaints to the police, and you gave some examples of the sorts of responses, such as it's not worth it, or police. It sounds like you saying police have not been equipped to have appropriate levels of communication with children and young people with disabilities. Have I understood that correctly?
Yes, I think there are some states where both interviewing training is provided to police in relation to children and in relation to disability. It's not clear to me that there are states where both of those things occur, or that the same person is equipped with both of those sets of knowledge. But I would also say that it's quite rare for sometimes there's poor recognition of the fact that this is a child with disability coming forward, and so some of those protections may not be put in place at the beginning. We know that police recognition of disability is also not great and not systematically recorded, and that can have impacts on whether or not particular protections are made available to an individual.
So you've really foreshadowed the next stage of what I was going to ask you about that, which is whether or not you're able to pinpoint again for us whether or not any state or territory, in your experience, is better than the others with respect to police interaction with children and young people making complaints of sexual abuse.
I think there are differences. Each jurisdiction has its own kind of arrangements around the kinds of supports that can be provided to children with disability coming forward. I'm not sure that I would feel able to say which one was best or better than others. I think that we have had circumstances, for example, where a child has come forward and is speaking to the police. The police don't fully understand what the child is saying, and a support worker is called in from the organisation that was providing the care, so someone who's in an inappropriate position to be supporting that child in that instance because of conflicts of interest. I know that, for example, there are some ways around that have come about. So advocates will often support people disclosing. So there are other ways, but I don't think that any one state stands out. Unfortunately, it depends on who's around in a particular state.
Thank you. Ms. Porteous, I didn't have any particular question to direct to you, but I certainly invite you, if you wish, to comment on any of the matters that have been raised by the panel in those areas. No, thank you. Commissioner Fitzgerald.
Just a couple of specific ones. Can I, Dr. Cadwallader, in relation to people with disabilities, can I just ask a couple of questions? The first is, what, if any, will be the impact of the National Disability Insurance Scheme in relation to establishing national standards, in particular dealing with inappropriate conduct within services? Given that some of the services we're talking about don't fall within that scheme, but some do, do you have a view about that as a positive mechanism for achieving national standards for children and other people with disabilities?
So the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Framework is obviously under development at the moment. We made a submission to it in the last few months. The framework that has been proposed is not sensitive to the specific needs of children and young people. It also is, to be frank, disappointing. It is not oriented towards... we feel that in many respects it is repeating a lot of the existing issues within the sector, and doesn't demonstrate the kinds of change that we would like to see around, for example, a body that has the capacity for own motion inquiries and so on. I would also say that the NDIS is a big change, and it's one that has a lot of focus for a lot of people. It also will only provide funding for individualised packages for about 10% of the population of people with disability. So in some respects, it's quite a small portion of the kinds of services that that a child and an adult with disability might need. And in relation to that, I think one of the things we were concerned about with the proposed framework was that it was focused solely on disability-related services, so specialist services, where we see, for example, children with disability being subjected to restricted practices in schools, which fall outside of most of the limitations on restricted practices that happen in disability services. So we think that in this space we need an overarching framework that ensures protection both within mainstream and disability services for adults and children with disability.
That leads on to the issue. There are a number of children with disabilities that are in out-of-home care services around Australia. Is there a sense within the disability advocacy area that there are sufficient safeguards for those children or recognition of their particular needs in the general out-of-home care systems that currently operate?
There is a perspective that their needs are poorly recognised, that many of their needs may be dismissed as trauma impacts rather than as disability, or as children simply being troubled because of their background. They may well be troubled because of their background. However, we would say that nonetheless these trauma impacts may produce impairments that result in disability, and that services should be made available to those children for their support. So I suppose that the kind of point of that is that I suspect that if we ever got the data from the Child Protection National Minimum Data Set regarding the number of children with disability in out-of-home care, I suspect that that would be dramatic underreporting of the rates of disability amongst children in out-of-home care.
Thanks very much for that. Ms. Sheedy, you made a comment earlier which was that many of the children that were taken into care, many of the care leavers, their own children have ended up in the care system. And you would be aware through your extensive and excellent support in so many private sessions that we have heard that on a number of occasions. One of the questions that's often asked in private sessions is whether the person believes that their children or grandchildren are in a safer place today in the care system, particularly the out-of-home care system. I was wondering whether you have a view on that, not only personal view, but one that's come from your ongoing involvement with so many care leavers whose children today or grandchildren today are in out-of-home care.
Are they in a safer place than what we were? I don't think so.
Could you just elaborate on why you held that view?
Well, when you hear of multiple foster placements that children endure, you know, I don't think governments in this country understand that, you know, a child who is deemed that we're going to remove that child from an unsafe situation, that's the first trauma. The second trauma is removing the child, and then the third trauma is to put the child into the hands of strangers. And some of those strangers do more damage than the original family of origin. And many of our people say they would have preferred, you know, they went from the frying pan into the fire. They would have preferred to have stayed with their family even if it was abusive. They weren't being sodomised or raped. And so I think that, you know, I want governments to look at all the trauma that a child endures. You know, people think that they're removing a child from an unsafe situation and that they are rescuing the child, but they're actually starting a whole new set of issues for that child. And we're talking about abandonment, and that if you don't get it put into place therapy from the day one, you're just creating lifelong consequences for that child.
There's been huge changes in the out-of-home care system over a period of time. Do you see any positive measures that you, notwithstanding that view, that would have made a huge difference to your own members, people that were in the out-of-home care system? So I just wanted you to reflect on, given your extraordinary experience in this area and you've watched it over such a long period of time, can you point to one or two things that you think have made a difference even if overall you believe the out-of-home care system still is not a safe environment or a safe enough environment?
Well, they're not warehousing children anymore. They provide $1,000 to children when they leave care to buy white goods. It's not enough, but at least it's something. They provide them with a birth certificate. That's really good. We have to pay for ours still. They keep copious notes on children today, and they're not as judgmental. I would, that's my understanding. They're not as judgmental in their report writing. They're a bit more sensitive. There's actually Create. There was nothing for us when we left care. We got a suitcase full of government-issued clothing if we were lucky, and told her, "Can I be myself here? Piss off." And, if we got married before we were 21, we had to have the government's permission to get married. There's a lot more support out there for people who've been in care. But it should be extended till they're 25. And it should be there for the lifetime, really, because good functioning families look after their children regardless of the age of the child. And governments as corporate parents are lousy parents. They don't care about us. They didn't care about us when we were in care, and they certainly don't care about us when we've left care.
Thank you. Can I just ask Ms. Porteous, my final question? You indicated that in your homeless service and in many homeless services there are children that are both in out-of-home care and have moved out of out-of-home care, and there's often a confusion about all of that right across Australia. One of the issues for us is that if they've moved into the homeless person service, they're not less than, that may be the end port in terms of service delivery, formal service delivery for many of these kids. Across the nation, are we delivering appropriate interventions to deal with the sexual and other abuse that some children have suffered whilst they've been in out-of-home care once they get into the homeless person system? In other words, they've moved from one set of traumatic experiences and they've ended up in these homeless person services. Have we seen any movement, change, improvement in the way in which we intervene, knowing that some of the children, some of the young people coming into those services have experienced not only trauma generally, but specifically because of physical and sexual abuse?
My experience in that is limited. I don't think I could comment adequately. But in regards to Ms Sheedy and the young people speaking this morning, it's the number of young people entering care is concerning, and I echo their sentiment that the overwhelming departments in each state, they're taking young people or children and infants into their care and young people, but there seems to be inadequate exit options, which is making young people enter the homelessness services. And I don't think that's an adequate solution, and it's just sad. I also feel that there needs to be more benchmarking and best practice standards and overseeing of placement options, which are above and beyond the formalised care settings to informal care settings. There seems to be new non-government agencies popping up each day and almost a rush because, these guys have the magic wand, it's a new placement option. And I don't know that there's the adequate checks and measures being in place prior to young people being referred to that service. I also fear that at times non-government agencies may be cutting costs when taking young people into care by using unqualified staff, possibly outsourcing staff, and making cost-cutting arrangements, say having a sleep shift. When we're working with such challenging behaviours, I wholeheartedly believe we need awake staff to oversee these young people in our care, and that concerns me.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Milroy.
Yeah, I just have one question about records. We've heard a lot this morning already about the difficulty that people have in accessing their records after leaving care. and I'm happy for anyone to answer this, what do you think the ideal would be for someone when they're coming up to exiting care in regard to what documents or records they should have at that point in time, as opposed to then having to come back later and find their records at a later date?
As part of the national framework, we worked with each state government and we developed a Go Your Own Way kit, and we came up with a checklist, which is a list of things that young people needed to exit care successfully. So every government has endorsed it, and we have produced it. We're about to do an evaluation. So in that checklist were things like they needed access to their health records. Some states have a health passport system where the kids' immunisation records are kept in one place. Obviously, they need their birth certificate. They need to have access to their file and whatever that is associated with their file. So there's an established list of things that the children and young people need, and that was developed looking at what was in each legislation. So it's not something that we just did, it was a good idea. It was actually based in legislation. The difficulty is in accessing it. And one of the comments that I sort of haven't made is that very much we've got good legislation, really good policy across the country that governs the way that we interact in child protection at the area. But what the problem seems to be is in the actual practice of what we do. And the practice is a bit wobbly, and I think part of that is due to the fact that there are no formal mechanisms for monitoring. I've just been overseas, and in England they have areas like when they'll be looking at has the child got their records, there's actually a reviewing officer that makes sure these things are done before the child leaves care. Then there's the Ofsted report, which is independent, done by an arm of government that comes in and looks at all of the things that they're supposed to have done and interviews children and young people independently of government to make sure these things are done. And it's human nature, I think, if you don't have, you've got rules in place but no one's checking if you're following them, I think that's where the wobble is between practice and policy. And those record-keeping things are very difficult for us to monitor because of that. It's just not happening. And just getting data overall, each state government keeps data for Create. We think part of the reason we have trouble accessing children and young people's records is because often the departments literally, their own systems are so poor that when we get the data, we can have anything up to 30% of the data being incorrect. The child may have moved, the names may be different, they may have been returned home, 1,000 reasons, but the data is a real issue across every state and territory.
So there's an overarching framework that identifies at least a checklist that might include health records, legal documents and that sort of thing.
Yes.
What about the more narrative approach to the child's life story, photographs, other sorts of events that they may have been involved with, things that they've done at school, that type of thing? Is there anything that governs where that information is kept or given to the child?
I think it's very agency and state specific. Some states do it incredibly well. Life story work is really, predominant in organisations like Bernardo's, Life Without Barriers. They do an excellent job of making sure the kids have got those types of access to those things. There's a lot of work being done, in conjunction with universities about lifestyle work, getting them up onto the web so that the kids can access them no matter where they are. Often what happens, those types of records may be with one carer, then the child moves placements, and sometimes the carers want to keep them as part of their own history and whatever, which is understandable. Or they may lose contact with the kids, or they might have left in acrimonious terms, and it's the last thing a busy caseworker thinks of is picking up the photos that belong from little Freddie and taking them over to the next placement. So that type of stuff, whilst incredibly important, especially for older people who have left care, it's part of who you are, become less important in the system because they're not really, they're not given that level of importance they need to.
Did anyone else want to make a comment on that?
I just wanted to, whilst I think I agree that having a letter that elaborates why a child has been removed, there are some specific issues around the removal of both children with disability and children from parents with disability. In many instances, children with disability may be understood as a risk factor. I'm putting that in scare quotes, for the family breakdown, which positions the disability as the problem for the family, rather than, say, the support needs not being met. And similarly, there are cases where parents have been forced to relinquish children in order to ensure that they can actually access support services, which is obviously an unacceptable situation, but is one that, if it was recorded improperly, could be quite devastating for the child. It's also parents with disability. Just while we're talking about the kind of necessity of out-of-home care, parents with disability will often have, so children are removed from them at a rate of 10 times the rest of the population, and this is often occurs without supports being put in place to support their parenting beforehand. I think that the information about those processes that is passed on to the child needs to be carefully looked at to make sure that it is not blaming the child for family breakdown, and also to ensure that children understand that parents may not have wished to relinquish them or to have them removed, and that there may be circumstances around that obviously we would say that there are inadequate supports provided to families to stay together, and I guess I would want to make sure that that was part of how recording happened.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honour. I've nothing further.
Nothing further? No. Thank you very much to the panel. Again, thank you for your cooperation with us. Thank you to your various supports for coming in today as well.
Panel 3, 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.
10 o'clock tomorrow, thank you.